All right, we're ready for 1 Corinthians chapter 3. Let's review where we've been, and then we're going to see where we're going and get underway with chapter 3 here in a second. Chapter 1, what was it about? Divisions and the wisdom of men. Yes, chapter 1. It focused primarily on the nature of the recipient of the message. Chapter 2 was what? Very good. And it focused on the nature of the message. So let's get ahead of ourselves. If I can find what I did with my questions. Here we go. Question number 6. What's chapter 3 about? Nature of the messenger. And it has to do with the nature of those who preach the gospel. They are mere messengers or ministers. All right. This is our outline we're following. The book divides itself naturally from chapters 6 to 7, as we've mentioned multiple times, and we'll mention again and again, as he starts into chapter 7 now concerning the things wherever you wrote to me. So, starting in chapter 7 has to do with questions the Corinthians asked Paul. But there were some problems that he had learned by report. And there were divisions. Some saying, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Cephas, I'm of Christ. Not only that, there seems to be strife, as we're going to see in chapter 4, over, I think, pointing towards spiritual gifts a little bit later. There was a lack of discipline. There was fornication. There was litigation. We're still in the division section, chapters 1 to 4. So, what is chapter 3 about? Well, we've already answered question number 6. It has to do with the nature of the messenger and how that preachers are merely servants. Now, in case you haven't been here or maybe have forgotten, we've talked from chapter 1 about the misunderstanding some had of the nature of the preachers. As Paul or Apollos or any other preacher come along, they were viewed as much like the philosophers, and I like the way he sounds, and so I'm his follower. I'm a follower of Apollos. But you can follow Paul because you're a follower of him and you like what he says and how he says it. And so they were viewing preachers as nothing more than philosophers and rallying around the men themselves. And so the focal point of chapters 3 and 4 has to do with the nature of the messenger. And the nature is that the messenger or preachers are merely servants. They're not men creating followings of themselves. Make sense? So, we've looked at this before. We'll look at it again next week. But this is a 3-point summary of the first 4 chapters. The nature of the recipient, the nature of the message, and the nature of the messenger. And so here's the kind of people that receive the gospel. Here is the nature of the gospel itself. And furthermore, this is the nature of the messenger. And so when I understand that it's not those who are interested in the high wisdom of the world that are interested in the gospel. And the gospel is not something man has devised himself. It's a revelation of God. And the messenger is nothing but a minister or a servant. That changes the whole perspective that the division was based upon. That preachers are nothing more than philosophers. All right, let's go to question number 1. Why had Paul written to the Corinthians as babes? All right, they're still carnal and they're following after men. They're not able to bear more mature teaching at the moment. Question 2, verses 1 through 4 show a contrast between those who are blank and those who are blank. What are the 2 blanks? All right, carnal and spiritual. Here's spiritual and or mature, and those who are babes are those who are carnal. Those are the 2 contrasts. We'll say more about that here in a moment. Let's get one more question out of the way, then we'll go to our text. Paul did what and who watered? Paul planted and Apollos watered, and God gave the increase. God caused the growth. All right, chapter 3, I call simply preachers are mere ministers. 4 things happen here. To follow men is to be carnal and not spiritual. We'll talk about what that contrast is in a moment. And then his focal point is that preachers are ministers and laborers. That's all they are. They're servants. And then you'll talk about those who seem to be wise are actually foolish. And then his point is that preachers are ministers, and the focal point here is for you. They're your servants, and they're ministers for you, is the point. We'll get to that here momentarily. So let's start into verses 1 to 4. To follow after men is to be carnal. Now let's go back again, at least in thought. I'm not asking you to turn there. You can remember this part. Chapter 1 talks about, I am of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Cephas, I'm of Christ. And it wasn't just that they had different men they liked, but they were even divided over that. Arguing over, I'm of Paul. No, I'm not of Paul. I like Apollos better. Again, treating them like philosophers. So his point here is to have that kind of mentality, to have that kind of division, to have that kind of strife is to be carnal and not spiritual. So let's get verses 1 and 2. This is why Paul wrote to them as unto babes. Verse 1. I could not speak to you as to spiritual. People is supplied by the translators, which is okay, that's good. I didn't write to you as unto spiritual people, but as to carnal, as to babes in Christ. I'll come back and define those in just a second. Let's go on and get verse 2. Because they are babes and carnal, what did he say at verse 2? I fed you with milk and not with solid food. What does that mean? What's the milk? And what's the solid food? Milk is the basics. That's used that way in Hebrews. Same writer in Hebrews, if he be the writer of Hebrews, and I think he is, uses that terminology of the milk is for those that are babes. Peter uses that expression in 1 Peter 2. And solid food would have reference to what? Maturity? Of which there are some things with reference to the word that are deeper, that are not the simple basics, but has to do with the deeper things of the word. All right, we'll come back to that in a moment. And he said, I taught you with milk and not with meat or solid food. Why? The rest of verse 2. They weren't ready for it, and even now, still not ready for it. All right, let's look at this contrast. Let's get a definition in the context of what this is all about. The idea of the spiritual and the carnal being in contact. I didn't write into you as unto spiritual, but as unto carnal. So the context is going to define for me, and if the word is in italics, or the phrase is in italics, it means it's been supplied. I've supplied it in the contrast. But spiritual is in contrast to carnal. So if I can understand what spiritual is, then I can understand what carnal is. If I understand what carnal is, that gives me some insight to spiritual. If I understand what a babe is spiritually, then I understand what the contrast. If that's immature, this means mature. Milk has reference to the simple things that the babe can handle. Solid food has to that which those that are mature can handle. Over here, they are able to receive the word, according to verse 3. They're not able to receive, that is, the meatier things. And I want you to notice this phrase at verse 3 now. Verse 3 says, for you're still carnal, wherein there's envy and strife among you. Are you not carnal and behaving like mere men? I'm reading the New King James. If you have footnotes supplied by translators, check your footnote at verse 3. Follow over, particularly if you have center reference columns. It'll say walking according to man. That's what it means by behaving like mere men. It's not like you're behaving like men versus, but you're walking after man. That's the idea. Over here, if you're spiritual, you're walking according to God. Over there, you're walking according to the thinking of man. And so he said, you're carnal, you're babes, you're immature. You're not able to receive the meatier things. You're walking like men. This is the way men think. But those who walk after God and according to God think more maturely, and they're able to receive the meatier things of the law. I want to go back to verse 3 for a moment. I fed you with milk and not with... let's go back to verse 2. Verse 3 is where I'm wanting to go. For you are still carnal. No, I'm wanting to go verse 2. I'll get it right in a minute. I fed you with milk and not with solid food, for until now you're not able to receive it. And even now you're still not able. All right. One commentator made the observation, and I think he's correct at verse 2, there is no severe rebuke in verse 2, or censure as he called it. But there is a censure at verse 3. And what's the difference? Well, I think this is the difference. There's not a problem with being a babe in Christ, is there? For a period of time. The problem is, finish my sentence now, staying a babe and not maturing and not growing. This reminds us of what chapter or what passage? Ought to come quickly to mind. All right, that's one passage. In 1 Corinthians 13, when I was a child, I thought I was a devil. When I became a man, I put away childish things. So there's the maturity. Who was rebuked? You ought to be able to teach. Hebrews 5. Remember Hebrews 5 and verse 12, that when the time you ought to be teachers. In other words, you should have grown to the point you could teach others, but you've got to be taught again the things that you once knew. Well, that's the carnal, the babe, the person with milk not able to receive, walking according to man. So they haven't matured. So at verse 2, there's not a problem with being a babe in Christ at any age. Is there? No. You might have a 70-year-old person who just learned the gospel and we just baptized them, and spiritually they're a babe and we have to feed them with milk. Anything wrong with that? No. But suppose someone is now 40 years old, though, but they've been a Christian since 20, and they're still having to be fed like a babe. Is there a problem? Yeah, there's a big problem. They've should have been growing for 20 years. They ought to be able to help teach that 70-year-old who's now a babe, but they can't. In fact, that 70-year-old may be teaching them a little bit because he's growing and learning quickly. So verse 3, there is a censure, there is a rebuke. You're still carnal, and where there's envy and strife and division, are you not carnal and behaving like men? So verses 3 and 4, the envy, the strife, the division shows and is evidence that there is carnality and lack of maturity on their part. Now verse 4, for one says, I'm of Paul, same thing we saw in chapter 1. Another says, I'm of Apollos, are you not carnal? So that division, following after men, those two concepts prove that indeed you are immature, you're not spiritual. Now one writer suggests, I believe it was R.C. Trench, says the word carnal, this is I think an important distinction, is not anti-spiritual, but unspiritual. But there's more to his quotation than that. I'm giving you the summary of that. It's not anti-spiritual, but is unspiritual. In other words, they're just not progressing. Another way of wording that is, the person who is a babe and stays a babe, they're not opposed to spiritual growth and spiritual maturity. They're just not doing it. See the difference? Some are opposed to it in the sense that they are anti-spiritual. They're not interested in spiritual things at all. They're not interested in God. But there are those who are interested to some degree, but they're just not growing and developing as they should. And that fits a lot of Christians. But unfortunately, most of those wouldn't come to Bible class. All right. Questions on verses 1 to 4, what this is all about. It's a good point. And I want to get to this a similar point later about verse 8 and 9, 5, 8 and 9. That each one has a different role. Each one can fulfill a different function. But the very point you're touching on, I have known years ago, back in the 80s, where I was preaching at the time, I remember two particular preachers. There was one, and I won't mention his name, who come, and it was in-depth material. It was always in-depth Bible study. And I would sit there taking my Bible and I'm thinking, I wish he'd slow down because I'm making notes and scribbling in my margin of my text, learning. He would take a text, he'd explain it by the context and show the application thereof. And then we'd have another meeting where another guy would come and he wouldn't say much. It was a lot of fluff. And guess which one everybody raved about it being the guy they really loved? The fluff. And when we'd have this guy back again for a meeting, that they was like, we're having him again. He's so boring. And yet it was deep Bible study where you'd learn the text. And yet they were supposed to be on the same team. But we were pitting them one against the other. Make sense? All right. Anything else on verses 1 to 4? To follow men and to be carnal is not spiritual at all. All right. Let's go to the next section now. And let's get the key to this verse. So we're coming back to the outline if you're copying that. You might go to verse 5 if you don't have this marked in your Bible. I've done this for my own purpose, so that months later, years later, when I'm not studying 1 Corinthians, and someone asks me about chapter 3, I can flip over and I see the word ministers underlined, and I see the word laborers underlined, or workers. I know what this chapter is all about. I can see it clearly on the page. So you might go and underline the word ministers at verse 5. Who are Paul and Apollos? But ministers. What's the word minister mean? Servant. It's the same word, by the way, for an officer in the church. Deacon. Same word for deacon. Now, that doesn't mean that Paul and Apollos were deacons in the official sense of 1 Timothy 3. The word deacon just means servant. That's all it means. That's all it means. So they're ministers. All right, might underline that. Drop down to verse 9. For we are God's fellow workers. Your translation may use a different word, but it'll be parallel. Might underline that, draw a line between them, because this is what he means by their ministers. That's not a title they have, as I'm a minister of the gospel and you're not. We're workers, ministers, or as James P. Miller used to say, they're nothing but messenger boys for Jesus. All right, let's work our way through verses 5 to 17 and see if we can make some sense of this context. Starting at verse 5 through 8, preachers are ministers by whom you believe. That's all they are. Now let's get to our conclusion first, and then we'll come back and work through how we got there. If preachers are nothing but ministers and workers, therefore, as per the context of 1 Corinthians, or problems, all right. We're not to be followers of the man, but of his message. What else? If they're mere workers,
they have the same responsibility as each individual. We have the same responsibility as you do. Just we're not the one up on the podium teaching the class.
okay.
We should all be teaching workers.
All of us are ministers. All of us are workers. Good point. All right, let's go to verse 5 now. Who is Paul and who is Apollos but ministers, servants, through whom you believed, as the Lord gave each one. Now let's look at that phrase, as the Lord gave each one. Similar phrases used over in Romans 12, as God has dealt to every man the measure of faith, had to do with distribution of abilities. I think that's how that's used here. Paul and Apollos, as Annie Lou just mentioned, they were different men. One was an eloquent speaker, the other was not. Paul was very effective at establishing churches, apparently, because he established a bunch. I don't remember much. You may find occasion you say, well, he established, but Apollos establishing many churches, I don't know much about. But I do know about him speaking and eloquently speaking and working with churches, like the church at Corinth. So the idea of Paul said, I planted, Apollos watered. We'll get to that in a moment. I don't think he's talking about baptism. He's talking about the idea of as in agriculture, one can do the planting, another one comes along and waters, but both are essential, but it's God that gives the increase. But I think he's focusing on varying abilities of the ministers. Paul was great at establishing churches, but he wasn't a great speaker. And yet here's Apollos, who's a great speaker, could teach and edify those that have already been taught, perhaps better than Paul. Make sense? And yet they're on the same team. There's some preachers that are excellent writers. And that's where they have shined. I mean, they have written, and I have told some preachers that you need to just lock yourself in a room and just write and write and write and write so we'll have it for years to come. Some are excellent students in the sense they know how to delve into the text, but they're not great speakers. Not mentioning name, I've got a friend that I've known for years that I've urged him to write commentaries. Keep writing them. And because we need what's in his mind on the prophets for generations to come. And yet, he's not a great speaker. He's not the most eloquent speaker there ever was. Some are great speakers and hold gospel meetings and crowds come and people are converted, where this guy over here that's a great commentator doesn't do that well in gospel meetings. Make sense? Some are great debaters and others are great encouragers. Everybody's got their own ability. Now, let's go to verse 6. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. The focal point is on God and what God did. And verse 7 now, for neither he who plants is anything nor he who waters, but God who gives increase. Same point at verse 6. The focal point needs to be on what God has done, not what Apollos did or what. But I'm trying to get down to verse 9. At verse 9, now starting at verse 9 through, well, before we get to verse 9, verses 5 to 8, preachers are mere ministers by whom we believe. Does that make sense? Any questions, comments, insights? Let's start at verse 9. Preachers labor and build upon the foundation. Let's get verse 9. For we are God's fellows workers, and you are God's field and building. Gives two illustrations of working in the kingdom. What are they? A building and a crop. Is that what it is? And so when you have a crop that you're putting out, God's field, and you're putting out this crop of wheat, the focal point is not on the guy that does the sowing of the wheat or the guy that harvests the wheat. The focal point is on the wheat itself and God who caused it to grow, isn't it? Same thing with the building. The focal point, if you have a house built, your focal point is not on the contractor and then the builders and the ones who did the work, but on the house and the product when you got through, isn't it? So you are the building, you are the field, and all we are just workers that help in that process. Now, verse 10, what's his point at verse 10? Yes. Laying the foundation is preaching Christ, and Paul had done that. And God is the master builder, is his point, but each one according to his grace, that I have laid the foundation and another builds on it. And so Paul is saying that even in my work, I didn't try to lay the foundation and then I wanted to do everything else because I wanted all the glory and I wanted the followers. I didn't care if Apollos came along and built on top of what I'd preached. I didn't care if Cephas came along and did his work. I just did my work of preaching the gospel. I think that's his point. Now, at verse 10, let each one take heed how, there's two warnings given here. One in verse 10, one in verse 11. What's the first one? Let each one take how he builds on it. What's the point? Yes. I lay the foundation of Christ, and then someone comes along after me. Take heed how you build on top of that. You're not building, following after yourself. You're not teaching your own doctrine. But make sure you take heed. The second warning in verse 11 is what? Make sure when you're laying a foundation, you're laying the foundation of Christ. If you're laying the foundation of yourself and your abilities and how great you are, then you're building on the wrong foundation. Make sure you're just building on the foundation of Christ. So, verses 9 through 11, let's get verse 11 quickly. For no other foundation in that which is laid, which is Christ Jesus. Make sure the foundation is Jesus Christ. Now, 12 to 15 now is interesting. Every man's work is going to be revealed. What's his point? Let's get the point, and then we'll come back and see how we got to that point. All right. It's going to be recognizable, and and whether or not it's going to stand is going to come to light. So let's talk about two things that are under question here among students. One is the materials found in verse 12, the gold, the silver, the precious stones, the wood, hay, and the straw. I don't think his point is a guy may be building straw on the foundation instead of using gold or silver or stone or wood. But I think that the question is, what does that represent? I think it represents different kinds of people that make up the building or that we build with. And I think that's evident when we get to verse 13 and verse 14, that's the focal point, and that there are basically two classes. There's good building materials and there's bad building materials. In other words, go preach the gospel, and some people are going to come in to the kingdom, and they're not going to last. It's not because of the preaching that was done or the teaching that was done. It's because their heart isn't what it should be. Make sense? Like the parable of the sower. And so they're going to end up being straw or hay, and or stubble, or hay or straw. But some are going to be wood and precious stones. And so I think it has to do with the kind of material. Now the day at verse 13, let's get ahead of ourselves, then we're going to work through. The day is not a day of testing. I think it's the day of judgment. That in the day of judgment, when all is said and done, then it's going to be revealed the kind of materials we built with. In other words, I go preach to somebody and they obey the gospel, but they're a hypocrite. I go preach to somebody else and they're sincere, and one of them's going to be saved, another's going to be lost. And so the day is going to the day of judgment is going to reveal the kind of materials that I brought into the kingdom. Make sense? So let's work through it in that light. And if anyone builds on the foundation, here's the material: gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, or straw. Each one work be manifest, for the day will declare it, because it is revealed by fire, and fire will test each one's work. I think that's judgment. I'm not sure that's even referring to the fires of hell as much as it is judgment's going to put it to the test. For fire will test each one's work of what sort it is. All right, now what if I am building on top of a foundation someone else has laid, and the people I bring to the Lord end up turning away from the Lord? Does that reflect on me? Not necessarily, if I've done my work. That's assuming we're doing our work. All right, verse 14. If anyone's work which he builds on it endures, he'll receive a reward. I think that has to do with the joy that's involved. And if anyone's work is burned, he will suffer loss. Means he's going to be disappointed. But he himself will be saved as though through fire. Now what's his point there?
We'll make mistakes. And God's always willing to forgive them. Even though you might be sincere in your work, it may be still shortcoming of what God pleases God.
All right, that's altogether possible. Because we did what was right. We preached Christ and Christ crucified, and we built on that foundation. And so his point here is, Apollos is not going to be judged on how big a following he gets. This goes back to the concept of chapter 1. Apollos gets a bigger following because people are following him. Well, he's going to be saved because he got a bigger following. And Paul over here maybe didn't get his bigger following. It's not based on the number of people following you. What's based on is, did they do their work? And so Apollos teaches some people and they go astray. Well, then God's going to condemn him. No. Now, if he did his work, he's still going to be saved, but they may go astray. Because the day of judgment is going to reveal how everything was built. So it's not based on the number of followers they got. It's going to be based on whether they did their work or not. Make sense? That's why in supporting men to preach, we're not so much interested in how many people did you baptize last year and how many of them stayed, but are you preaching and teaching the truth? That's all we're interested in. Make sense? Is he preaching the truth, but he's not making any converts? Well, so did Jeremiah. Jeremiah did the same thing. I think I'd support Jeremiah if he was living, wouldn't you? I'd fund all the money I could to Jeremiah, but he didn't make any converts. He wasn't too good at it in the sense of people responding to him. He did his job, though. All right, it's verse 16 and 17. What's the point here? Don't just say you're the temple of God. That's the point. But how does this lace into the context?
What you're a visual to the world. You're the temple of God.
All right, you're the temple of God. That's true. All right, let's get the wording of this, and let's come back and make a distinction between this and another chapter we're going to look at later in chapter 6. Do you not know you're the temple of God, and the Spirit of God dwells in you? The temple is where God dwelt. It's where praise and prayer was offered. It's where sacrifice was made. In this context, I think he's referring to the church being the temple of God. If anyone defiles the temple of God, God will destroy him. The temple of God is holy, which temple you are. I think he's referring to the church. Now, 1 Corinthians 6 talks about me as an individual being a temple. God dwells in me. God dwells in you. You're the temple. And I don't think those passages, while they may be similar, are to be connected. But nonetheless, here's the point. I think he's coming back to this principle of if you're creating following, or you follow after men, and there's the division we've been talking about, and it creates dissension and destroys the church, which dissension does, you're destroying the temple of God. Make sense? So, let's get that in mind. That is, he's talking about, preachers are nothing but ministers and laborers, and they build on the foundation. With that concept of building a building on a foundation, keep in mind the church is the temple of God, and if you end up destroying the temple, God's going to destroy you. So let me ask this question. How could one destroy the temple of God? I'll start giving you an idea, and then you can add to this. Discord does that, as per the context. If I'm guilty of creating discord and division, then I'm destroying the temple of God. How else could we destroy the temple of God? Good point. The whole context of the book will argue for the fact of a number of things. Taking a brother to court, lack of discipline destroys the temple of God. Fornication.
The undermining of the foundation. If I will destroy a building, let me undermine the foundation. I can bring it crumbling down.
Yes. You don't have to take the roof off.
That's right. To undermine the foundation, which is Jesus Christ, and start taking out that authority.
Good point. Good point. Preaching and teaching that destroys faith in God, faith in Christ, faith in the Word is undermining that whole principle. All right, let's move on because we've got about 5 minutes. So let's go to verses 18 to 20 now and talk about those who are wise are actually foolish. Now this ties back into chapter 1 again. I want to get to this because I want to drive to his conclusion down here at 20 and 21. Let's get 18 to 20. Let no one deceive himself. If anyone among you seems to be wise in this age, let him become a fool that he may become wise. Now, how do you become a fool? I mean, it's easy for some, but that's not what that's not what he's talking about here. All right, you become a fool in the sense of rejecting the word, like in chapter 1. But maybe something else is dealt with here. This is something, let's go back to verse 18. Let no one deceive you. If anyone among you seems to be wise in this age, let him become a fool. We're told to become a fool. So in what sense? Okay.
How man sees you, your fellow people, if you live, might think serving God is foolish. And the way you serve God is foolish.
Absolutely. Come to recognize man's wisdom and my own wisdom is nothing but foolishness. Here's God's plan and it's viewed as foolishness, and here's man's wisdom, and I've been following after that. I'm going to come over here and become a fool. I'm going to become what the world views as a fool. And when I do that, I have become actually wise. Yes. So now let's read verse 18 in that light. Let no one deceive you. If anyone among you seems to be wise in this age, let him become a fool that he might be wise. Here's why. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness with God. How do I know? He quotes from Job 5:13. The only quotation from the book of Job in the entire New Testament, by the way. The only time it's ever quoted. Not the only time it's referenced, the only time it's quoted. And this was from Eliphaz, who was not inspired, but he was correct in what he said. And the quote was, well, I've lost my place. He catches the wise in his own craftiness. In other words, God dismantles the wisdom of those who think themselves to be wise. And then a second quotation from Psalm 94. The Lord knows the thoughts of the wise and they're futile. In other words, God dismantles those who are wise. So here's his point. Those who seem to be wise are foolish. And so, instead of being wise in the eyes of men and following after the wisdom of men, you need to become a fool. Now let's get the last three verses here, 21, 22, and 23. His point at verse 21, let no one glory in men. When you're saying, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Cephas, I'm of Christ, you're glorying after men. Now underline this phrase, for all things are yours. What do you mean all things are yours? Well, Paul, Apollos, Cephas, the world, life, death, things present, things to come, all are yours. Might underline that again at verse 22. All are yours. Here's the point. Instead of you belonging to men, these men belong to you. You've got it reversed. In other words, when you say, I'm of Paul, you say, I am a servant of Paul. I serve him. And I'm of Apollos. Oh, I'm a servant of Apollos. No. Apollos is your servant. And so is Paul. Make sense? They are here to help you in your faith. So preachers, Bible class teachers, elders, whoever it may be, they're mere ministers and servants. And they're serving you versus you serving them. So you're not a follower of them. They work for you. They're working on your behalf. Now, when he ends at verse 23, and you are Christ, and Christ is God. Notice that he didn't put Christ in that list, that he said, for whether we're talking about Paul or Apollos or Cephas, and he didn't add, and Christ. That comes later. Christ is not yours. He is your servant in one sense, but you serve Christ. So he was in a different category. And so verse 23 mentions the idea of submission, that it's a sense in which they are submitting to you in service. And all of you submit to Christ, and even Christ, to show that submission is not a bad thing. Even Christ submitted to the Father. Make sense? So the key point, if you didn't get anything else, go back to verse 5 and verse 9, underline ministers and workers. And preachers are ministers, mere ministers are mere workers. That's the point. Maybe a minute to go. So practical lessons we've learned. What is it? I'm sorry? Good point. No place for boasting or competition. And here's an important point which I meant to make earlier. I'm glad you mentioned that. Preachers are not in competition with each other. If they're both are preaching the truth and one has this great ability and another one has another ability, they're not in competition. They're on the same team. Kind of like a ball team. One can pitch great and another one can hit great. They can work on the same team and try to accomplish the same goal. Make sense? Preachers are the same way. We'll stop there at chapter 4 next time.